Distinguished delegates, colleagues and friends, thank you for inviting me to participate in this side event during the 31st session of the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. I acknowledge the hosts, the Government of Finland and Honduras, and the organizers, the Alliance of NGOs in Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. The starting point for me at this side event is that the topic of gender-based violence as torture inflicted by non-state actors is not a new phenomenon for people who work in the field. The numerous manifestations, motivations, and non-state actors involved has been captured in submissions and reports presented to the UN human rights institutions, including treaty bodies and special procedures mechanisms. My work over the years has noted the language used by victims of gender-based violence, including referring to their experience as torture. For example, in the context of domestic violence and the inability to escape from a spouse who sleeps with a gun under his pillow. Another example is that of women and girls who experience violence in the extended family, including acid attacks and for being perceived as transgressing societal norms. Another example is the violence experienced by women in countries with pervasive problems linked to drugs and crime and gangs, where the torture manifests in horrific ways and includes physical and sexual violence, the mutilation of the body, and the placement of body parts in different locations of the city. Victims of trafficking, slavery-like practices, human rights defenders, victims of forced marriages, FGM, also describe their experience as torture. In non-conflict zones, I've heard women speak about the low-level warfare that they experience on a daily basis in their homes and communities due to gender-based violence. Unfortunately, the reality of such victims is not framed by the state as torture, but continues to be underpinned by notions of women as lesser beings whose experiences of human rights violations at the hands of non-state actors are not of the same importance as violence perpetrated in the public sphere or at the behest of the state. Globally, there is an acceptance that violence against women is a widespread and pervasive problem, and it is the foremost cause of death and disability amongst women, according to reports by the World Health Organization. However, despite such acknowledgement, the statistics indicate that response and prevention to all manifestations of violence against women is inadequate or non-existent, and impunity for such crimes is the norm. Thus, we meet today to once again raise awareness of non-state torture as experienced by women and girls, and to do so hopefully through the adoption of a declaration. The second point I'd like to raise is a recent journal article on engendering torture reinforces the reality that the Convention Against Torture and the committee's work had little interest in the early years in exploring the role that sex and gender may play regarding the practice of torture or other forms of ill treatment. By 1998, in just 25% of state reports monitoring was the issue of gender torture raised. However, we've seen improvements, and by 2020, research indicates that the committee is paying more attention to the gender dimensions of torture and other ill treatment, more especially in the context of violence against women. The adoption in 2007 of General Comment 2 reflects the shift in the monitoring work of the committee that is away from solely a state-centric approach to gender torture. Paragraph 18 is particularly strong regarding state responsibility for acts perpetrated by non-state actors. And it states, amongst others, the state bears responsibility for consenting to or acquiescing in impermissible acts, and the failure of the state enables non-state actors to commit acts with impunity, which are impermissible under the convention. Sadly, the author of this journal article, who was a member of CAT for many years, asserts that in recent years, some new members of the CAT committee have been challenging and rejecting the inclusion of issues regularly addressed by CAT concerning women and children. These new members argue that conclusions should be gender neutral, and they question the inclusion of domestic violence and the due diligence concept, which gives rise to positive obligations. This is a retrogressive development and is a warning sign in respect of the appointment of members who do not have a gendered understanding of torture. My third point is regarding my thematic reports during my tenure as the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women to the Human Rights Commission and the General Assembly, where I identify some continuing challenges in attaining the goal of elimination of all manifestations of gender-based violence against women and girls. Some of these challenges include the shift in understanding of gendered responses and also a shift to gender neutrality in laws, policies, and practices. The persistence of the public-private dichotomy and the binary approach in responses to gender-based violence. The failure of states to act with due diligence in their responses and preventative measures. The lack of transformative remedies that address root causes of gender-based violence at the individual, communal, institutional, and structural levels. The failure of states to make linkages between gender-based violence and other systems of oppression, which are a reality for women. Financial constraints and austerity measures, which result in cuts to social services spending, and the privileging of sexual violence in conflict, which we've seen in recent years, without understanding that the violence in conflict situation functions on a continuum and is exacerbated during times of conflict. And finally, the lack of specific legally binding obligations on states emanating from treaties within the international human rights systems for responding to, preventing, and eliminating violence against women and girls. The fourth point is the legitimacy of violence against women as a human rights normative claim has been established through soft law developments at the UN level and through hard law developments within 3 regional human rights systems. That is the African, the European, and the Inter-American systems, which are formal human rights systems as they currently exist. As I've noted in my reports, normativity without legality is the norm within the UN system in respect of violence against women. This is done through the approach of general recommendations and general comments, through concluding observations to state parties, reports, etc., by the treaty bodies. The use of general human rights principles of respect, protect, and fulfill, the principle of state responsibility to act with due diligence, and the use of non-discrimination norms are the usual interpretive tools used by monitoring bodies as they undertake their task of oversight of treaty obligations. These tools have been used to include the issue of violations by non-state actors and the principle of state responsibility for failure to protect against and prevent harm has been utilized to address accountability of states. The limitations and gaps within the older treaties has been addressed by some independent experts within the special procedures systems, and many activists have raised the issue of treaty amendments to address the normative gaps. I've raised the issue of the adoption of an optional protocol to CEDAW, or a new specific treaty on violence against women and girls, during my tenure as the mandate holder. However, there is a reluctance by treaty bodies to engage on this due to fears of loss of hard-won gains when opening up an existing treaty for change negotiations. The arguments about proliferation of treaties, duplication, fragmentation, and costs are often raised also. The hostility and threats to the treaty body system is a reality, but this should not completely shut the door to discussions about the need to reform an outdated system of human rights protections, which continues to render invisible women victims of all manifestations of gender-based violence. In conclusion, the call for a declaration by the organizers of this forum with the goal of raising international awareness on non-state torture, which is an issue of such gravity, is a sad indictment on the failure of adherence to the 1993 Vienna Declaration's articulation of women's rights are human rights and violence against women is a human rights violation. We need to do better. In 2022, to be calling for another soft law instrument, a declaration, to create awareness is a sad indictment, considering the failures of the UN system and also member states in terms of addressing the lack of accountability for non-state torture that women and girls experience. Thank you for your attention, and I'm sorry that I can't join you at the live event.